Racist teacher forces black boy to play piano to ridicule him, but his skill leaves her speechless. It was a Wednesday morning at Lincoln High School in Dallas, Texas. Caleb Johnson sat at his usual seat near the back of the classroom, staring down at the worksheet in front of him. The classroom buzzed with the usual chatter, the mix of excitement, nervous energy, and the impatience that always preceded history class. Caleb wasn't nervous, though. He had a habit of tapping his pencil against the desk when he was deep in thought. His mother always told him to stop, but it helped him think, and he wasn't about to change that. Mrs. Jennifer Clarkson, the history teacher, stood at the front of the room, her glasses perched on the tip of her nose as she flipped through her lesson plan. Mrs. Clarkson had been teaching for years, and her reputation was well known, strict but fair to those she favored. Caleb had never been one of them. There was no overt hostility from Mrs. Clarkson. She never raised her voice at Caleb or singled him out, but everyone knew the pattern. She rarely called on him during lessons, and when she did, it was either a glance of indifference or a slight pause before she moved on quickly, barely acknowledging his correct answers. "Yo, Caleb, you ever gonna get called on?" David Williams, a classmate who always sat next to him, whispered one afternoon. "You got like invisible student status or something?" Caleb gave him a half smile and shrugged, "Guess so." But that day, something felt different. As Mrs. Clarkson began her usual lecture on the Civil War, Caleb felt her eyes linger on him for a moment longer than usual. She called on him, something that had never happened before. "Caleb," Mrs. Clarkson said, her voice crisp, "why don't you answer this one for the class?" Caleb blinked in surprise, his hand still resting on the desk. Everyone's eyes shifted toward him, and for the first time in a long while, Caleb didn't feel invisible. He sat up straighter, scanning the board as the question appeared. What was the significance of General Sherman's march to the sea? The words came to him easily. General Sherman's march was a military campaign aimed at crippling the Confederacy's resources and morale, designed to break their will to fight. Mrs. Clarkson murmured, almost dismissively. "Not bad, not bad." Caleb noticed a few students exchange glances. David gave him a look, clearly surprised.
"Good job, man," David said quietly. The rest of the lesson carried on, but Caleb felt something shift. Mrs. Clarkson was watching him more than she ever had before. The usual pattern was broken. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but Caleb's heart skipped a beat when Mrs. Clarkson called his name. "Caleb, stay behind for a moment," she said, and the usual noise of students packing up faded as everyone turned to look at him. Caleb approached her desk, feeling the weight of her gaze. "I overheard you talking the other day, Caleb," Mrs. Clarkson began, her tone colder than usual. "About your grandfather. You said he was a musician." Caleb frowned. "Yeah, he played piano, jazz." Mrs. Clarkson's lips curled up into something resembling a smirk. "Interesting. You must have picked up a thing or two from him." Caleb didn't answer, but something in Mrs. Clarkson's tone unsettled him. He wasn't sure if she was mocking him or actually curious, but either way, he wasn't going to show any hesitation. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice thick with expectation. "Let's see what you've got. Play something for the class." That night, Caleb barely slept. His mind replayed the conversation over and over. He knew what Mrs. Clarkson expected: failure, embarrassment, the perfect opportunity to prove her assumptions about him. He wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. The next day, Caleb walked into class, feeling the eyes of his classmates on him as whispers spread. "You gonna play today?" David asked, sounding a bit too eager. "Yeah," Caleb replied, his voice calm. The lesson dragged on, but Caleb's mind was elsewhere. When the bell rang again, Mrs. Clarkson wasted no time. "Caleb, the piano. Play for the class," she said, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. The room fell into a tense silence as Caleb stood up. The old upright piano in the corner creaked as he made his way over. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the room, the whispers of his classmates barely audible now. Mrs. Clarkson's eyes followed him as he stood before the piano.
He ran his fingers lightly over the keys. They were stiff, and the piano was out of tune. Caleb inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He knew exactly what he was going to play, and he wasn't about to let anyone see him falter. Caleb sat down and began playing. The room, which had once been filled with murmurs and sidelong glances, now fell into an absolute silence. The first few notes of a blues progression filled the air. Caleb's fingers danced effortlessly over the keys, letting the rhythm flow from his fingertips. His classmates sat still, entranced by the unexpected beauty of his playing. Mrs. Clarkson's arms were crossed tightly, her expression unreadable, but even she couldn't ignore the raw emotion in the music. The sounds of the piano filled the room, telling a story only Caleb understood. He let himself get lost in the music, pushing through the complex runs and intricate chords his grandfather had taught him. The last note lingered in the air, and for a moment there was nothing but the silence of the classroom. Then the applause started. It came from the back of the room, slowly at first, then louder. Caleb didn't move. He didn't smile. He simply sat there, letting the energy of the moment wash over him. The class was in awe. Even Mrs. Clarkson, who had never shown any warmth toward Caleb, couldn't hide the shock on her face. The students looked at each other, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and admiration. But Caleb wasn't done. When he returned to his seat, he didn't let the applause distract him. He knew that for the first time, the classroom was no longer the same. Mrs. Clarkson's authority was no longer absolute. For the remainder of the class, the energy in the room felt different. Caleb could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, but it wasn't the same as before. There was no more mockery, no dismissiveness. Something had shifted, something irrevocable. David leaned over to Caleb, his voice low but full of respect. "Man, that was insane. I didn't know you could do that." His usual cocky demeanor had softened, and Caleb could tell he meant it. "Thanks," Caleb replied, offering a small smile. He had proven himself, not just to David, but to everyone who had ever underestimated him. Mrs. Clarkson, meanwhile, stood by her desk, her face a mask of professionalism. But Caleb could tell she was flustered. For the first time, her authority had been questioned, not by the students, but by the very person she had tried to diminish. "All right, let's get back to the lesson," Mrs. Clarkson said quickly, turning her attention back to the front of the room. Her voice was sharp, trying to regain control, but the room was no longer listening in the same way. Caleb sat in his chair, breathing slowly, but there was a calmness within him now. He didn't need their approval. He had already spoken, loud and clear, through his music. Mrs. Clarkson had wanted to use him as an example of failure, but he had turned the tables. He had made her see him for who he truly was, and that was something she couldn't undo. The bell rang, signaling the end of the class. Students quickly packed up their things, but the atmosphere was still thick with the residue of what had just happened. Caleb stood up slowly, slinging his bag over his shoulder. He glanced toward Mrs. Clarkson one last time before heading toward the door. "Caleb," she called out, her voice tight. He turned back, expecting some kind of reprimand, but instead she just stood there, her arms crossed, her lips pressed tightly together. She looked like she might say something meaningful, but in the end all she said was, "This is still my classroom." Caleb met her gaze unflinchingly. He had already said everything he needed to. "I know." With that, he turned and walked out of the classroom. As Caleb made his way down the hall, he could feel the eyes of his classmates on him. The whispers that followed him were different now, respectful, even admiring. He could hear snippets of their conversations, phrases like, "Did you see that?" and "Man, he can really play." It was a strange feeling. Caleb had always wanted to be seen, to be recognized for his talents, but he had never imagined it would happen like this. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about reclaiming his voice in a world that had so often tried to silence him. When he reached the cafeteria, he saw a few familiar faces waiting for him. David was sitting at a table, a grin plastered on his face. "Bro, you just flipped everything upside down," David said, shaking his head in disbelief. Caleb smiled. "Yeah, I guess I did." Sophie Davis, another classmate, approached him from across the room. "You were amazing. I had no idea you had that kind of skill." She sat down beside him, and for the first time, Caleb felt like he was being seen for who he was, not just the quiet, invisible kid. "You've been holding out on us," David added with a laugh. Caleb just shrugged, feeling a lightness in his chest. "Guess I didn't think anyone would care." Later that day, Caleb passed by Mrs. Clarkson's classroom again. He glanced inside and saw her at her desk, still staring at her lesson plan, her usual composure slightly shaken. Their eyes met briefly, but this time it was Caleb who looked away first. It wasn't a defiant gesture, it was just the acknowledgement that something had changed. Caleb wasn't looking for her approval anymore. He had already won that battle, not with words, but with his talent. The next day, when he entered the classroom, the dynamic had shifted again. Mrs. Clarkson was still in control, but the class seemed to operate on a different wavelength now. Students who had once ignored Caleb were now engaging with him more. David, who had always sat next to him in class, leaned over and gave him a subtle nod of respect. The whispers had quieted, and the energy was different, more respectful, more open. Even Mrs. Clarkson, who had once ignored Caleb, now seemed to keep a wary eye on him. It wasn't a harsh gaze anymore, but a more cautious one, as if she was recalibrating her perception of him. Caleb didn't mind. He wasn't interested in pleasing her or anyone else anymore. He had learned that when people try to silence you, the best thing you can do is let your talent speak for itself. After class that day, Caleb stopped by the local convenience store on his way home. Mr. Grant Harris, the shop owner, was behind the counter sorting through some inventory. When Caleb walked in, Mr. Harris looked up and offered a knowing smile. "You look like a kid who just did something important," Mr. Harris said, raising an eyebrow. Caleb hesitated for a moment, then smiled back. "Maybe I did." Mr. Harris nodded. "Good for you. You let them see you." When Caleb got home, the smell of fried catfish and cornbread filled the air. His mother, Tamara Johnson, was at the stove, humming as she prepared dinner. Caleb dropped his bag by the door and sat at the kitchen table, feeling the weight of the day lift off his shoulders. "How was your day?" his mother asked, glancing over her shoulder. Caleb paused for a moment, considering. "Long," he said, "but good." His mother turned, raising an eyebrow. "Good, huh? Sounds like something big happened." Caleb looked up at her, his smile small but genuine. "Yeah, something did." For the next 15 minutes, he told her everything. How Mrs. Clarkson had challenged him, how he had played the piano, how the class had changed. His mother listened quietly, her expression shifting from concern to pride to something softer, almost wistful. "Sounds like you made her uncomfortable," she said finally. "I think I did," Caleb replied, leaning back in his chair. His mother studied him for a moment, then smiled softly. "Good, because sometimes you've got to make people uncomfortable to help them see what they've been missing." The next day, the atmosphere at Lincoln High School felt different. Mrs. Clarkson continued to run her class as usual, still calling on the same students, still acting as if nothing had changed. But Caleb could feel it. The air was thicker now, charged with a sense of unspoken understanding. During lunch, a few students who had never spoken to Caleb before stopped by his table. "Dude, you were insane on that piano," Sophie said, sitting across from him. "How long have you been playing?" "Since I was 5, Caleb replied. David shook his head. "Man, you've been holding out on us." Caleb simply smiled, enjoying the feeling of being seen. Across the cafeteria, Mrs. Clarkson walked past, her tray in hand. Their eyes met briefly, and this time she looked away first. Caleb didn't look back. He had already said everything he needed to say. Some lessons aren't taught in books. Some moments don't happen in classrooms, and for Caleb Johnson, this was one of those moments. A moment that would change the way people saw him and the way he saw himself. The next few weeks at Lincoln High School passed by in a blur. Caleb continued to show up to class every day, his demeanor unchanged. The quiet confidence he had gained from the piano performance carried over into every interaction. It was as if, by playing that one piece, he had unlocked something deeper within himself. And now, the world around him was beginning to take notice. In Mrs. Clarkson's history class, things were different. Though her demeanor remained as stern and rigid as ever, Caleb noticed that she called on him more often. Not out of kindness or newfound respect, but because, perhaps for the first time, she realized he was more than the quiet, invisible student she had once dismissed. Caleb answered her questions with the same calm certainty he had demonstrated with the piano, but now there was an unspoken tension between them. Caleb knew it. Mrs. Clarkson knew it. At first, the shift was subtle. Mrs. Clarkson would glance at him occasionally, perhaps trying to read something on his face that hadn't been there before. Caleb would raise his hand, and for a fleeting second, the air in the room would grow heavy with anticipation. It wasn't just about history anymore. It was about power, perception, and the space that had once been occupied by doubt.
"Caleb, your thoughts on this?" Mrs. Clarkson would ask, a slight edge to her voice. "The economic collapse of the Confederacy," Caleb would reply, "was a direct result of the loss of infrastructure, especially after Sherman's march. By the end of the campaign, they were unable to maintain any substantial supply lines, weakening their military and civilian morale." The answer was textbook, but his delivery carried weight. Mrs. Clarkson would nod, though there was no warmth in her response. The class remained quieter when he spoke now, a respect that hadn't been there before. One morning after class, Caleb packed his bag slowly, his mind lost in thought. The bell had just rung, signaling the end of the period, and most students rushed out of the room. But Caleb stayed seated, gathering his things, not in any rush to leave. He had gotten used to the stillness after his performance, as if the room had shifted permanently. "Caleb," Mrs. Clarkson called out, her voice sounding almost apologetic. He looked up. The way she said his name now was different. There was no challenge in it, no thinly veiled mockery. Instead, it was almost neutral, yet laden with an unspoken understanding. "I just wanted to say, good work on the assignment last week. Your research on Reconstruction was thorough. Not many students grasped the complexity of the period, but you did." Caleb blinked, unsure of how to respond. He had come to expect indifference from her, not praise. "Thanks," he said, his tone guarded. He wasn't sure if this was her way of acknowledging what had happened, or if it was just her professional attempt to maintain the teacher-student dynamic. Either way, he wasn't ready to read too much into it. As he made his way toward the door, he passed David, who had been waiting for him by the hallway. David gave him a nod, a silent recognition of their bond that had grown since the piano performance. "You know, Mrs. Clarkson's been treating you differently lately," David said casually, following into step beside him. "Yeah, I noticed." Caleb's voice was steady. "But it's not about her anymore. It's about me." David gave him a look, not fully understanding, but also not pressing Caleb further. The words weren't necessary. The change had been felt by both of them. As the weeks went on, Caleb found himself becoming more connected with his peers. The students who had once ignored him now sought him out, not just because of his piano skills, but because they saw him differently. David, once the class clown who had mocked Caleb, now treated him with a quiet respect. Even Lucas Scott, the popular kid who had never given Caleb a second glance, started to engage with him more. One day, at lunch, Caleb sat with David, Sophie, and a few other classmates. Their table had become an unlikely gathering place for students who had previously kept to their own cliques. Sophie, who had always been a bit of an instigator, was the first to comment on the changes she had noticed. "You know, Caleb, I think we all underestimated you," she said, pushing her tray aside. "I thought you were just some quiet kid who didn't care about anything.
But after what you did with the piano, wow, you've got some serious talent." "Thanks," Caleb said, his voice calm but pleased. "It's more than just talent, though. It's about having something to say. I'm not gonna let anyone talk over me anymore." David, who had been listening in, gave a small laugh. "You've definitely got that 'don't mess with me' vibe now. It's kinda cool." The group laughed, but Caleb could see the shift in their eyes. There was no longer a sense of condescension, no judgment about his silence or his quiet demeanor. They respected him now, not just because of his piano playing, but because he had shown them who he truly was. A few days later, Caleb found himself walking past Mrs. Clarkson's classroom again. He had learned to tune out the noise around him, but something about the way she stood at the front of the room caught his attention. She was still at her desk, but now there was a subtle hesitation in the way she moved, a quiet understanding that seemed to radiate from her. Their eyes met briefly as Caleb stood outside the door. He expected her to turn away quickly, as she had done in the past, but this time she held his gaze for just a moment longer. Caleb didn't smile, nor did he feel the need to. He wasn't looking for approval anymore. He had already won the respect he sought, not through confrontation, but through his actions. He nodded at her once, a simple gesture, before walking away. That evening, after school, Caleb stopped by Mr. Harris's store again. The old man was at the counter, leaning over a pile of magazines, but when he saw Caleb, he greeted him with that same knowing smile. "You look like a man who's found his place," Mr. Harris said, his tone warm. Caleb paused, considering his words. "Maybe I have." Mr. Harris studied him for a moment, nodding. "You let your talent speak, didn't you?"
"I did," Caleb said, his voice steady. "And now, I don't have to prove myself anymore." "Good," Mr. Harris replied, his voice full of wisdom. "Because the world has a funny way of making us question our worth. But the thing is, when you show who you are, really show it, no one can ignore you." Caleb smiled softly, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. "Yeah, I think I finally get that." The rest of the year at Lincoln High School unfolded like any other. Caleb continued to excel academically, and his musical talent became something of legend. He began to play the piano more often, even during lunch breaks, when the classroom was empty and the sound of his music could fill the halls in a way that spoke louder than any words ever could. As graduation approached, Caleb stood at the front of the classroom during his final history exam. Mrs. Clarkson handed him his test with a steady hand, but this time she didn't look at him the way she once had. There was no more judgment in her eyes, no more skepticism. She had seen him for who he was, and he knew that. As Caleb walked out of her classroom one last time, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had already said everything he needed to say, and the world was finally listening. The day Caleb graduated from high school was a blur of excitement and nervous anticipation. But for Caleb, it was also the beginning of something new. He had shown the world his worth, not by shouting or seeking validation, but by simply letting his talent speak louder than anyone's doubts. As he stood on stage, accepting his diploma, Caleb smiled to himself. He hadn't just made it through high school, he had made it through a world that had tried to silence him, and he had done it on his own terms. Some lessons aren't taught in books. Some moments change everything, whether you're ready for them or not. But when you stand tall and let your talents shine, the world will have no choice but to listen. The story of Caleb Johnson teaches powerful life lessons about self-worth, resilience, and the importance of letting one's talents speak for themselves. At the heart of the story is Caleb's journey from being underestimated and overlooked to standing confidently in his own abilities. When others try to silence or dismiss you, the best response isn't to conform to their expectations, but to let your strengths shine, as Caleb does with his piano playing. His performance is not just about proving others wrong, it's about embracing who he truly is and refusing to be defined by someone else's limited view of him. This story reminds us that sometimes the most profound ways to challenge prejudice, doubt, and bias are not through confrontation, but through personal achievement and self-expression. Life often asks us to prove ourselves in ways that may seem unfair or biased, but through perseverance and confidence in our abilities, we can change how others perceive us. Ultimately, Caleb's journey underscores the importance of being true to ourselves,
trusting our talents, and never letting others' assumptions limit our potential. If you found this video helpful or thought-provoking, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. It really helps more people discover our content. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the latest updates from our channel. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next videos.